Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Meredith, and thank you to the League. It's really a pleasure to be among you here tonight, and I'm so grateful to the League for hosting this event. As you all already know, I was elected to this office a little less than 2 years ago, and the reason I even had an opportunity to run for this office is because Secretary of State went to jail and had to resign the office. And so this really put a fine point not only on my campaign in 2016, but on my campaign now, because to me it highlights the importance of having integrity and honesty and a dedication to making sure that our public officials follow the law here in New Mexico. So since the time I was elected, I have dedicated myself in the Secretary of State's office to ensuring that we shine a light on dark money in politics, to making sure that financial dealings of politicians are posted online and transparent so that citizens can know whose interests are behind our politicians. And I've held candidates accountable for campaign finance violations because it's extremely important that individuals running for office or who are engaged in the political process in New Mexico know that our laws are to be followed and that there will be penalties for not doing that. I've also made it easier to vote. I've worked with the Motor Vehicle Department to make it even easier for you to register or update your voter registration at the DMV. I've worked with our disability community to ensure that they had access, including blind voters, to absentee ballots. And I formed the Native American Voting Task Force to improve education and participation in Indian country here in New Mexico. But there's still more work to be done, and that's why I'm running for re-election. I want to overhaul the state's campaign finance information system to make sure that candidates can follow the law and citizens can follow the money. I want to make sure that we continue our record of providing good services to our business services community as well. And with that, I thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you so much.
Mr. Clarkson.
Good evening, and thank you for hosting the event. I'm Dr. Gavin Clarkson, and I'm running for Secretary of State to create jobs. And I know that may strike some of you as unusual because historically the Secretary of State, everybody's assumed, has just been a county clerk on steroids. But in reality, we have elections every November, but we need jobs every single day. And every single small business that gets formed in New Mexico has to go through the Secretary of State's office. Everybody that does business in New Mexico has to interact with the Secretary of State's office. And every time a small business goes to get an equipment loan or an inventory loan, they have to interact with the Secretary of State's office. And I think we can all agree in this room, we do not have enough jobs in New Mexico. I've been a school teacher since 1991. When I taught my students at New Mexico State, 95% of them, in order to get a job, had to leave the state. We have a major brain drain, and it's a huge problem. And it's not necessarily a partisan problem. It's Democrats need jobs, Republicans need jobs, Independents need jobs, Libertarians, shoot, even the token communist needs a job. So I am and you notice that you've never had a Secretary of State candidate, and all the reporters I've talked to, and maybe you can verify, have never discussed primarily job creation as a major function. But it's critical. We're the only state in the Southwest that is shrinking. Forbes magazine lists us as number 47 in terms of the worst states to do business. So again, my emphasis is job creation, but I don't want to ignore ethics in elections because those are important too. And I think New Mexicans are tired of the Secretary of State's office being weaponized against political opponents, be they Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Libertarians, and they are certainly tired of the Secretary of State's office and the holders of that office weaponizing law enforcement against whistleblowers. And we'll talk more about that later this evening. But we have lost faith in this office, and I am running to restore faith to this office in a nonpartisan, bipartisan way for all New Mexicans, regardless of party or for those with no party. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're now going to proceed to the questions, and these are 1-minute questions. We'll start with Maggie Toulouse Oliver. What changes, if any, do you support to New Mexico's voting procedures? Changes such as online or mail-in voting or requiring photo IDs at the polls?
Well, I think New Mexico is actually a model for the rest of the country in terms of how we run elections. We do so many things so well here. We provide ample early voting opportunities. We have no-fault absentee voting, which means anybody can apply for an absentee ballot for any reason. We consolidated to vote centers in 2011 so that we could allow any voter to vote at any polling location, increasing convenience for the voter. We conduct post-election audits utilizing paper ballots so that we can make sure that our votes are counted as cast. But there are some things that we can do moving forward and that I am looking forward to advocating starting next year. I'd like to see us implement same-day voter registration here in New Mexico so that the literally thousands of people who are forced to cast provisional ballots that go uncounted at the polls are able to have their votes counted on election day, especially those who have recently moved to the state, especially after the deadline. I would like to see us potentially move to vote at home initiatives, so every voter could receive a ballot in the mail like they do in similar states like Colorado and Washington. Thank you.
Mr.
Yes, so one thing I support is same-day voter registration as long as you can prove two things, that you're a citizen and that you're a resident. Because we need to have an election system where citizens can vote and where non-citizens can't vote. And we should not have a system that allows people to register zombies, aliens, or canines to vote and and gives zombies absentee ballots. That's fraud. That's wrong. And I'm sure will be a lot of discussion about voter fraud here because some of that has been happening under my opponent, and it's wrong. And by the way, the one thing I do not support is straight party voting, because the legislature, the role of the Secretary of State is to follow the law, not make the law. Yet it's interesting that the only attempt to rig an election in 2018 was the Secretary of State's unconstitutional attempt to jam straight party voting down all of your throats. And the Supreme Court, following my amicus brief that I wrote along with Michael Hendricks, said that she doesn't have that authority. And that and they said at the Supreme Court, if she wants to make the law, she should resign and run for the legislature. Because straight party voting is not something the Secretary of State is authorized to do.
Okay. We are now moving on to question 2. Mr. Clarkson, what improvements, if any, would you make to the campaign finance information system?
Well, one of the things, there's a lot of discussion about foreign influence and dark money influence, and yet, when the largest foreign influence in our elections right now comes from a Hungarian billionaire named George Soros. And I would make sure that it's very clear where that money goes. If it goes in legally, that's fine. If it gets funneled through PACs and then you play a shell game with PACs to hide it from the voters, I find it highly hypocritical to be discussing dark money when the candidate is a major recipient of dark money. Every single one of my donors is disclosed, and I'm not getting any money from any shell game PACs. So I absolutely think that, and again, I'm a former computer scientist with a cybersecurity background. A lot of the problems at the Secretary of State are solvable through information technology solutions. And we should make it very easy to figure out. But we should absolutely stop the current unconstitutional assault on churches and charities. And I anticipate that there will be a further lawsuit, and I expect another victory before the Supreme Court.
Maggie Toulouse Oliver.
So the Campaign Finance Information System is the database that's on the Secretary of State's website that provides information to citizens and the media and interested parties about who is investing in candidate and political party campaigns and how that money is being spent. And there's a lot that we're doing well in New Mexico, but there's a lot that needs to be improved. And this last year I secured some financing from the legislature to develop what I'm hoping is going to be a state-of-the-art model for campaign finance information systems for the rest of the country, where citizens and voters and interested parties can go and not only find out which individuals have been contributing, but what industries those individuals are coming from, so that we can see a full picture of who is funding our candidates for office, because we as citizens deserve that information, and that is how we can make informed decisions at the polls. So I'm very excited to develop this new system. We will be doing a lot of work over the next couple of years, and we'll have it ready by 2020. Thank you.
Secretary of State Maggie Toulouse Oliver, would you please answer this question? And then Mr. Clarkson, what can the Secretary of State do to encourage voter turnout, especially among young people and minority voters, Hispanic and Native American voters?
We live in a day and age where politics is toxic, it is polarized, and participation in politics, particularly among young voters, is frowned upon. The statistics show that of the newly registered voters in the state over this last year, a majority have registered as being unaffiliated with the political parties. So to my mind, there are a couple of things that we need to do and that I have been working on as your Secretary of State. The first and foremost is, of course, to provide as much voter education as possible. And from my office's point of view, that means making sure that voters all across the state know how, where, and when they can cast a ballot. Providing opportunities for mock elections, making sure that voters have access to voter guides such as the League of Women Voters that talk about the issues and the candidates and where they stand. But secondly, we need to work very hard to increase civility and reduce the toxicity of politics in this country. Because if we don't, our democracy is going to suffer as a result. And I will work very hard to make sure that civility is the primary goal of this office.
Mr. Clarkson.
Well, in answer to your earlier question about the 19th Amendment, actually, I'm a member of a group that got to vote after women got to vote, because American Indians didn't get the right to vote until 1924. And I'm very interested in obviously increasing the amount of Native American population. They are the oldest group of citizens in New Mexico. They've been here longer than anybody else. And yet every single time my opponent registers a dog, an alien, or a zombie to vote, it suppresses the power of your vote and their votes. And again, we've had way too many examples of people who change their parties and vote after they die. And it's just wrong. It's simply wrong. And it's a very simple information technology solution. And I find it ironic that you would talk about increasing civility, yet your office has been weaponized against your political opponents. And similarly, when you were at Bernalillo County, you even weaponized law enforcement against whistleblowers. And that's just simply wrong. And by the way, every assertion I'm making, I can prove.
Okay, the next question for Secretary of State. How would you convince the legislature to approve additional expenditures or change the way it funds the Secretary of State's office for elections?
Is that to me first?
Yes.
Well, plain and simple, the best way to do this is to be a good steward of the money that they're given. My opponent has squandered your tax dollars on partisan efforts. You collectively in this room, she cost you $133,000 when she wrongfully went against Steve Pierce for doing the exact same thing that Bill Richardson had done. And that doesn't count the amount of Attorney General funds that were spent on lawyers. And again, that's just rampant partisanship. That's weaponizing her office, and you as the taxpayer pay for that. Now, the other thing, we still haven't figured out how much we wasted on the nonsense with straight party voting. So the first thing you got to do is, before you ask for more money, stop wasting the money that you're being given on partisan nonsense. You know, you want to talk about civility? Stop being so partisan.
Point of order. I'm sorry. I thought the ground rules were
Yes.
about your own.
Yes, and I was just going to say, we really do not appreciate any attacks or, any comments on the other candidates. You're talking about what you will do in office.
Well, but to stop doing what is wrong, to talk about the fact that taxpayer money has been wasted by the existing information, and to say that I'm going to stop wasting that taxpayer money by necessity involves talking about what is wrong with the status quo. So, if we're going to have a forum where we're talking about, we're going to establish differences,
Okay, but
then
we
we
have
have
to
to be able to
make
have a
this more
conversation
civil.
about the status quo.
Please make your comments more civil. Thank you. I've lost track here. Maggie Toulouse Oliver.
So Meredith, to answer your question, what I have been doing with the Secretary of State's office and what I will continue to do is to demonstrate to the legislature, first and foremost, the fact that the Secretary of State's office has been underfunded for many, many years. We run probably one of the smallest Secretary of State's offices in the entire country, and we have a tremendous number of duties: oversight of elections statewide, overseeing 8 separate ethics statutes, overseeing the public election fund and making sure that those funds are distributed appropriately to candidates who qualify for those funds, to say nothing of the Business Services Division, which is a huge enterprise that moved over from the Public Regulation Commission in 2014. The fact is that we are understaffed, that we have a tremendous number of very important duties. Enforcement of the law is extremely important, because if we don't enforce the law, then we have the Wild West. Then we have candidates and campaigns and political committees and public officials who don't think that they have to comply with the law because it won't be enforced. So this is the case that I have been and will continue to make to the legislature. Thank you.
What role would you expect to take regarding legal or technical challenges to implementing the 2018 Local Election Act?
So I am already taking that role as your Secretary of State. The Local Election Act is a wonderful new law that is going to consolidate all local elections that are nonpartisan onto one election day every odd-numbered year. And this is going to be a great opportunity for voters, because typically in any given year, we can see 2, 3, 4 local elections, special elections occurring. Voter fatigue sets in. We don't have enough information. We don't know that these elections are even happening, and these organizations are making taxing decisions that affect each and every one of us. So we are already working through the process of making sure that we are getting the Local Election Act up and running. We are working together with impacted entities to give them all the information they need, including city clerks and school boards. And we are anticipating doing some cleanup to the law that we hope to work together with the league and with our colleagues at the community colleges, et cetera, to make sure it's a law that works for everyone.
Mr. Clarkson.
Okay, so just to be clear, every single response I'm going to give you is either going to be grounded in law or grounded in policy. I'm not making any personal attacks. I'm only making strong policy differences, and strong differences of legal opinion are not the same as a personal attack. I'm not going into any of my opponent's personal history whatsoever, and I will not do so because I don't think that's appropriate. But I do believe it is appropriate to highlight strong policy differences. So in terms of the legal and technical challenges, it goes back to the number one critical issue is the fact that our voter rolls are not accurate. And we cannot have fair elections without accurate voter rolls. And it's a very simple technical thing. And most people assume that voter fraud is for partisan purposes, but most of the voter fraud happens in counties where only one party's in charge. And you can have millions of dollars being decided about these local elections, and those elections can be decided by 20 votes. You register 20 dead people to vote, and all of a sudden your patron network gets a couple $1 million. That is garden variety corruption, and it's wrong.
Okay. So the second question for the Secretary of State's office is, and this starts with Mr. Clarkson, do you support open primaries? Why or why not?
Well, this is a question that the League of Women Voters asked in the earlier forum down in Las Cruces. And my position is, it doesn't matter what my personal position is, because my job is to enforce the law as passed by the legislature. I can see that there are arguments for open primaries. I can see there are arguments against open primaries. It doesn't matter what my position is. If the legislature asks for a policy position, I am somebody who tries to make decisions and make recommendations based on data. And so we will go out and gather the information about the arguments for open primaries, the arguments against open primaries, and then we will provide that information to the policymakers so they can make informed policy decisions. The Secretary of State doesn't make law. The Secretary of State the role of the Secretary of State is to enforce the law. And again, the Supreme Court made that abundantly clear 5-0 when we had this debacle with straight party voting. And we anticipate we'll probably have the same thing with the assault on churches and charities that is unconstitutional at both the state and the federal level.
Okay. Do you support open primaries? Why or why not?
So as the chief election official for the state of New Mexico with almost 12 years of experience of running elections here in New Mexico, I'm someone who used to be against open primaries, and I have changed my mind, and I strongly favor them now. And the reason for that is that in a primary election after primary election that I oversaw as Bernalillo County Clerk, and now this year's election that I oversaw as Secretary of State, I saw literally thousands of voters show up to the polls on Election Day during the primary and want to cast a ballot. And either they weren't properly registered, didn't know it, didn't realize there was a deadline, didn't realize we have a closed primary state. Whatever their reason, these were voters, eligible citizens who wanted to have their voices heard. And in many cases, a primary election is the last stop because there is not a general election opponent on the ballot. Primary elections are taxpayer funded, they are state run. We should allow every eligible citizen to have their say in primary elections. I fully support them, and I will advise the legislature to that effect. Thank you.
How widespread is voter fraud in New Mexico? Where is the data? What is the data? I'll rephrase that.
So the data that we have about voter fraud are national level data. And what independent, nonpartisan academic researchers have found is that voter fraud exists. It does. There are people out there who try to take advantage of the system. But to the extent it exists, it's very rare, and it's not systemic. And the challenge that we have here in New Mexico is that, and this happened to me many times, well, a handful of times when I was county clerk. Every time we became aware of potential voter fraud being committed, we'd look into the matter, and if we found that there were legitimate concerns around the issue as opposed to just a clerical error or something like that, we got law enforcement involved. And I think we should have an absolutely zero tolerance policy when it comes to law enforcement and make sure that anybody who's trying to interfere with our election system is prosecuted to the full extent of the law. That is my record as county clerk, that is my record as Secretary of State, and that's what I will continue to do as your Secretary of State.
Mr. Clarkson.
I have to fundamentally disagree with that characterization. It couldn't not be farther from the truth. If you look at the 2012 Senate election, there was widespread voter fraud, and somebody went to jail. The FBI and the state police put somebody in jail for falsifying signatures on a ballot petition that when my opponent was commissioner, or was county clerk of Bernalillo County, she falsely testified that she had verified every single one of those signatures, and clearly it was false. Because otherwise you would not have had the FBI and the state police putting somebody in jail for falsifying petition signatures. And by the way, when she says she gets law enforcement involved, she only gets law enforcement involved when there's a whistleblower involved that shows that she has registered a dog or registered zombies. So she weaponizes law enforcement against whistleblowers, particularly when those whistleblowers are identifying sexual predators in her office.
This is.
I can prove it.
An audience question has been, would you please, Mr. Clarkson, identify one aspect of your opponent's message that you support?
Well, I didn't think we were directing questions to individual people, but I will commend my opponent for her voter convenience centers in Bernalillo County. It's a good idea. We should make voting convenience more convenient. The problem is she sets up these voter convenience centers that are open 30 days a year, and she forces Bernalillo County to pay for them 12 months out of the year. So Bernalillo County spends $721,000 for empty buildings 11 months out of the year, and because of budget shortfalls, Bernalillo County employees had to go on furlough. So yes, I think voter convenience centers are a good idea, but I think you should do them like pop-up stores. We have pop-up Halloween stores. We don't have Halloween stores open all year long. We don't need our voter convenience centers to be rented 12 months out of the year when they're only used right before the primary and right before the general election. It's squandering taxpayer dollars, just like has happened to the Secretary of State.
Okay. Maggie Toulouse Oliver, would you please identify one aspect of your opponent's message that you support?
Sure, I completely agree that we need more jobs in New Mexico. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. I've lost track now. Have I given Secretary of State, you get your second question. What improvements, if any, would you make to the voter registration and management systems?
So this year we rolled out of the Secretary of State's office a new voter registration management system that our county clerks are now working with. We have become a member of the Electronic Registration Information Center. We share data with 22 other states and the District of Columbia. We receive an update from the Social Security Master Death File on a regular basis, as well as our state corrections and our state vital services. So our county clerks who manage the voter registration databases in our state are doing tremendous work to make sure that information is accurate and up to date. We implemented online voter registration so that it's easy and automated voter registration at MVD for folks who have a driver's license to get their registration up to date. You know, the challenge with New Mexico is we have a very mobile population, and often folks will move from county to county. One of the things I would like to see, and one of the main reasons I support same-day registration, which will help keep us even more up to date, is that if a voter moves between counties or into the state after the deadline, they can do that update and have the most accurate information on file. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, I'm a Republican and I totally oppose voter suppression. Let me say that again. I'm a Republican and I totally oppose voter suppression. I think every single citizen should be able to vote. I think every single non-citizen should not be able to vote. That's the law, and the job of the Secretary of State is to enforce the law. So as I said earlier, I support same-day registration as long as you can prove two things. You're a citizen and you're a resident. And by the way, I support voter ID, but I want to make sure that tribal IDs are valid IDs. And as Secretary of State, if it's within my power, I will provide a free voter ID to every citizen so that every citizen can demonstrate that they're a citizen when they go to the polls. Because every single time a non-citizen votes, it suppresses the power of each and every voter in this room. And it's wrong. And it's not that hard to do. We can go through, I'm a former computer scientist with a cybersecurity background. We can take the zombies off the rolls. It's not that hard.
Okay, now we're moving to the Land Commissioner. And I've been asked by several people in the audience to please tone it down. I think we're not following the ground rules. We have to have the civil conversation here, and I don't think we need to hear more about zombies. Thank you. I don't know of any that have voted.
I can tell you about two. Two people, their parents were lifelong Republicans, switched parties, and voted in the primary after they were dead. If you want the records, I can give them to you.
Okay. The question for Maggie Toulouse Oliver is, what needs to be done to prevent hacking of election machines or voter rolls?
Well, we already adopt a number of best practices in this regard here in New Mexico, and we've done it for quite a while because back in 2006, we had the foresight as a state to know that we didn't want our votes to be tampered with. We didn't want black box machines. We wanted to be sure that we had a paper record, so we switched to an all-paper ballot system, which is ultimately the best way that we can recreate an election if there's any question or any doubt that our votes have been tampered with. We also don't ever connect our voting tabulators to the internet. And the reason for that is that we don't want to make them vulnerable to hacking. We have to maintain best practices around the security of those machines and around how we transfer results. We have formed a partnership and are working closely with the Department of Homeland Security to bring all the tools and resources to bear that we can to protect not only our state network, but to help county clerks protect their networks. The ones that do need assistance, a lot of county clerks have really great systems already. And we are doing everything that we possibly can. The challenge is always that you can't predict the future, so that's why we conduct post-election audits after every general election to make sure your votes were counted as cast.
Mr. Clarkson.
I actually agree that paper ballots are a great idea. As I said, I'm a former computer scientist with a cybersecurity background and a national security clearance. And I think with paper ballots, I think our election system was robust and resilient. There was no hacking by the Russians of the voting machines in New Mexico in 2016. It didn't happen because we have paper ballots. We had a resilient system. But hack-proof is not the same as fraud-proof. Hack-proof is not the same as fraud-proof. And the only person, the only foreign interest that's trying to influence our election in 2018 is our favorite Hungarian billionaire. And the only actual attempt to rig an election in 2019 was the unconstitutional attempt to implement straight party voting. And the Supreme Court agreed with me, 5-0. So again, my opponent referred to our lawsuit as unfounded, and it turns out the only unfounded component of the rigging attempt was saying that somehow she had the authority to implement straight party voting. And the Supreme Court agreed with me, majority Democrats.
Basically, the next question is, do you support reforms intended to boost publicly funded candidates and discourage private outside money and PACs? Why or why not?
Well, the question of publicly funded elections is really interesting in the current situation, because my opponent told Justice Klingman, running for the Supreme Court, that he was not eligible for public funding. But then magically, as soon as her party put forward a candidate for the Supreme Court, amazingly, the position reversed 180 degrees and public funding was available. So I fundamentally disagree with the notion that the Secretary of State should be weaponizing that office in the area of public funding. I think if a race is entitled to public funding, all candidates in that race should be eligible for public funding. If a race is not eligible for public funding, no candidate should be eligible for public funding. But my opponent weaponizes her office against people that she disagrees with, and that's wrong. And as Secretary of State, if you're a Democrat, if you're a Libertarian, you have nothing to fear from me. If you're eligible for public funding, you'll get it.
I know, but okay, Maggie Toulouse Oliver.
So there are some fixes that we need to our public financing legislation here in New Mexico. For example, this year we had vacancies that arose at the 11th hour, and it was already well past time for certain candidates to be able to seek their $5 contributions, to get certified, et cetera, et cetera. So there are shortcomings in the law. That law, for example, doesn't anticipate independent candidates or minor party candidates who might file in the summer. And just to get us all on the same page, this is the law that provides public financing for our statewide judicial positions and folks who are running for Public Regulation Commission. And the reason why we have that law and why I fought so hard to make sure that our public financing fund, our public education fund, was fully funded by the legislature, who had been rating that fund year after year, is because it provides a level playing field for these candidates so that they don't have to seek private financing, so that they can avoid both the real and appearance of being biased toward any individuals who may have given them funds. So I will continue to fight to fix the law and make sure that it's serving those who it's intended to serve. Thank you.
Okay, this is Secretary of State. We're back to election security. How can there be integrity in the voting process when the software for the vote counting machines is not written by the Secretary of State's office?
So currently, we don't have the internal capacity. No Secretary of State's office in the country actually has the internal capacity to do that kind of code writing. What we do is we work with certified election vendors. We have a process here in the state. We have a voting system certification committee. That committee reviews applications for certification of voting systems in our state. And part of what it does, if each member wants to, is it goes through the code ad nauseum. We get a test version of the code that's available to any member of the public during that certification process that can actually look through the code itself, check to see if there's any flaws, any bugs, any weirdness in there that could be manipulated or tampered with. I'm looking at our county clerk from Santa Fe County across the room. She's on that certification committee. They make a recommendation to my office, and we certify that, and then we oversee it moving forward. And again, we have a paper ballot system in New Mexico with post-election audits after every general election so that we make sure that every single vote was counted as cast.
As somebody who's a former software developer, I certainly understand the challenge of doing software development, and there's nothing wrong necessarily with using an outside vendor to provide election software. There is, however, a huge problem when you then use that vendor to program in straight party voting, and you cost the taxpayer money on straight party voting, even while there's pending litigation before the Supreme Court. And you're so confident that you're right that you go in and spend all this taxpayer money, you get spanked down 5-0, and then you have to spend money to undo everything that you just did. And in the interest of transparency, I've submitted an IPRA request to find out how much of your tax dollars were spent on that programming and that reprogramming. Thus far, we don't know. I think that would, we have many members of the press here this evening. I think that would be a very interesting question to ask. How much of our tax dollars were squandered in a partisan attempt to rig an election?
That was not the question. Okay, so let's go to the next question for the Secretary of State. What, in your experience and background, has prepared you to be Secretary of State?
Well, I'm a businessman. I've been an entrepreneur. I've been a finance professor. I've taught entrepreneurship. I've taught secure transactions, corporate formation, and as my opponent said, a large chunk of what the office does involves the stuff that I have been teaching for years. I have also, while I have not supervised elections at the county level, I have supervised elections at the tribal level. And from my perspective, tribal votes count just as much as off-reservation votes. In terms of, I have a computer science and a cybersecurity background, and I also will not embarrass the New Mexican people. I've never cheated on a spouse. I have never had sexual relations with a coworker, and we had a huge problem with this. We had a huge problem with this in Joniata County. We had a clerk that just resigned. You can boo. Scott Kraling had to resign for having inappropriate sexual relations with a coworker, and that will not happen with me.
Time is up. Okay, there'll be no more questions. Oh, Maggie? Do you remember the question?
Yeah, I do. Just give me a little minute. I have been passionate about our democracy and about our citizens' ability to make their voices heard at the polls since I was 4 years old when my mom took me to vote with her for the first time in 1980. And I've literally dedicated my entire adult life to registering, educating, and ensuring that voters all across the state of New Mexico have that same opportunity. I went to UNM. I got an undergraduate degree in political science and Spanish and a master's degree in political science, and I thought I was going to be a political science professor. But in 2004, I just decided I couldn't sit in the ivory tower, and I had to work to make sure that voters were registered and getting to the polls. And I continued on that career, and I became the Bernalillo County Clerk in 2007, and I oversaw elections in the largest county in the state for 10 years, and we made huge strides in improving the election process. I'm so proud of what we did there, and I'm so proud of the work that my fellow county clerks and I embarked on over the course of those 10 years. And I'm further incredibly proud to be your Secretary of State for the last almost 2 years, sitting on the Government Coordinating Council for the Department of Homeland Security and serving as Treasurer of our National Secretaries of State. Thank you.
I'm going to give each candidate a minute to give a closing statement. Mr. Clarkson.
I realize there are huge policy differences between me and my opponent, and I realize it may be uncomfortable when I highlight those policy differences. Let's be clear. I want to create jobs in New Mexico. I want free and fair elections, and I also want to make sure that we return faith to our institutions. And unfortunately, there has been way too much weaponization and retaliation on a partisan basis. I have personally fought against domestic violence and child sexual assault my entire adult life because it's a huge problem on our reservations. My opponent suppressed information about a sexual predator in her office until after an election, and I think that's wrong. She attempted to implement straight party voting in an election in which she was a participant for partisan advantage. And I think that was wrong, and the Supreme Court agreed with me. And let me be clear, I protect whistleblowers. If a whistleblower comes to me with an example of voter fraud, and this gentleman over here came to me and demonstrated that he had registered 3 dead people to vote, and turned it into law enforcement, and my opponent decided to retaliate and throw him in jail. And I think that was wrong.
Maggie?
So thank you, Meredith, and thank you to the league, and thank you for all of you for being here tonight. Since I was elected Secretary of State almost 2 years ago, I have been making good on my promises. I have been working hard to shine a light on dark money in politics and to make sure that politicians and candidates and political parties are held accountable in this state and to restore integrity to the Secretary of State's office. And I have done that, and I have kept my promises. If I'm reelected, I'm going to support policies like same-day voter registration. We're going to make a state-of-the-art, wonderful, robust campaign finance system that will give all of us as citizens ample information about how money in politics is working here in New Mexico. And I will continue to make voting and access to the ballot box a priority of the office. My name is Maggie Toulouse Oliver. I am your Secretary of State. I ask humbly for your support this November, because even though I've already done a lot in this first couple of years in office, I'm just getting started. Thank you.